Are you listening? Damn. Yeah. Yeah.
Another episode of Trash Talk. I'm TJ O'Connor. With me, as always, Damian the Wolverine Hill. Trash Talk is brought to you by the sponsors of the show, Valhalla Combat Sports Incorporated, Ink Shrinks Tattoo, Origin Wellness CBD, Spartan Martial Arts, the Striking Institute, James Clark Sports Psychology and Hypnosis Therapy, the Fighters, and my mom. Damian, how you doing tonight, man?
A whole lot better than you.
Oh, man, I bet. If you got literally any sleep, you're doing better than me. But we're here today answering a fan question that came in. And when it came in, I thought it was a great question, but I thought it was a little funny at first because I don't know if there was hesitancy on their end, but they kind of prefaced it by saying, sorry if this is a stupid question. And I don't want to say this just because, we're Trash Talk, but there's literally no stupid questions. If there's something you want to hear us talk about, send it into the fan page. But I thought it was a great question. And they basically were saying, how is it that you see sometimes you'll see a fighter go pro after, 2, 3, 4 amateur fights, whereas sometimes you see fighters with 10, 15, almost more amateur fights sometimes. And they were just asking, why is that? And, I thought it was a great question. I wanted to bring it up, see what you had to think.
Man, that's actually a fun one to answer. And there's a lot of different elements that come into play, too. You got to take into consideration some of these fighters have families. I mean, most of them do. They want to make some money off of it, and also the age that they either started at or that they're at the point in their career where they feel like they need to make some money, or this needs to be the chance. I shouldn't waste any time as an amateur. And I feel like that's some of the reasons why, I mean, guys, the clock is ticking for some of them. Some of them, financial reasons. They have a family. They don't want to be taking any damage or any time off of work and not getting paid. And those, sometimes it's like those guys seem like they're the ones that are trying to cash out right away. And then there's other times where it's not necessarily they're ready to go pro. They just believe that they're ready to go pro after 1 or 2 fights. And we've seen that before. But then there's also the times where it's almost the same thing, but it's not necessarily the fighter's ego. It's the competition around them. Sometimes you just beat all of the guys right away, all of the people that were the guys, you know what I mean, in quotation marks and all that, but like you beat the guys that were supposed to be the cream of the crop, and you're like, well, let me test myself out as a pro. And of course you're going to feel that way, but then it turns out that those guys weren't really that good, or what, sometimes maybe you are that good, but I feel like that's some of the reasons on why guys go pro a little bit sooner. And I don't know. Am I missing anything? Have you?
No, I feel like you hit it on the head right away with, obviously their financial situation. There's some guys who literally can't afford to go fight and not get paid. It's just not a scenario they live in. And I think another big one, because I mean, if you look at MMA in general, think of the most amateur fights you've ever seen an amateur MMA fighter have, that's always going to be very low if you look at like amateur boxing or something like that. So it's a different sport. And a lot of the times, though, you get a coach that transferred over from that traditional boxing standpoint. He had 50, 60 amateur fights when he was young. And his mindset is the fighter can't go pro until they've been tested like that. And you see that sometimes as well. So I feel like sometimes it may be the coaches, but ultimately it's going to be the fighter at the end of the day. I mean, there's people out there that are like, oh, no, I just love it for the competition. I want to go fight. And we've all met that guy that's like, you're not going to punch me in the face for free. It's just not fucking happening.
Flip side. All right, we're going to flip this. Why do you think there's some of the amateurs that stay amateur for longer than not necessarily what they should? Because if they don't feel like they should go pro, then they don't go pro. But longer than what you would expect, or maybe you as an outside, what is it? What's the word that I'm looking for? Viewer. yeah, whatever. As an outside viewer, somebody watching that person from the outside, not necessarily involved, you see that, man, you're kind of tearing stuff up as an amateur, and you're right around that step to go pro, but they don't go pro. And I
I'm
don't
sorry,
know what.
you cut out a little bit on my end when you said you're tearing stuff up as an amateur.
I think you know where I was going. Just you know the question.
Yeah, I think the reason for that a lot of times is it's ultimately going to come down to, again, the fighter. The fighter is going to know when they're ready, and I mean the recipe's out there. I mean, if you just what I was just saying, when you look at boxing, who are the best guys? The guys with the most experience. You get more comfortable. You've seen every situation to the point where now when you go pro and it really matters and there's money on the line and this is a potential career or just an opportunity, you can take the most of that because you're as ready as you can be. You've seen those scenarios. I mean, there's so many guys that I can think of that are like that. I mean, the first one that pops in my head, just right off the top of my head, John Castaneda. How many amateur fights did he have? And he found his groove. And when he turned pro, like a bat out of hell, he went. And you could look at it from an outside point of view and go, you maybe didn't need those last 2 or 3 amateur fights. But hey, his coaches knew, he knew, and it fucking worked. So the recipe is going to be different for everybody. And you just got to know yourself as a fighter. And I mean, as a coach, you got to know your fighter as well.
Yeah. I mean, and I feel like there's some of those guys too where they stay back as an amateur because they know that they're trying to make a career out of this. And we've said it multiple times on the show, it's good to not be surprised as a pro when everything counts. It's good not to be surprised in the fight, like have everything that's going to happen in the fight happen in the gym. But at the same time, that's never going to happen if you're training safe. But if all of those, the most dangerous things could happen to you as an amateur, and all of that is technically experience, I see why guys would want to take in all of that experience, especially if they're planning on making a longer opportunity out of a longer career. We're messing with the Dana White quote, if you guys haven't heard. But anyway, well, that go look it up.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily to say that the guys that do go pro sooner don't take their career seriously. It's just I can't really explain it. There's 2 different mindsets behind it, and I feel like I understand both. And there's plenty of guys that have gone pro or have 1 to no amateur experience, and they've gotten all of their experience as a pro, and they've had some successful pro careers. So, I mean, there's no blueprint.
No, there's farthest thing from it. And like you said, there's a perfect example of guys like that. Guys that are, they might be the local, they competed in just jiu-jitsu, or they competed in kickboxing, which is still fights, but we're talking about MMA fights specifically, where they're so experienced to now where you kind of mentioned earlier, they have no competition that they can fight as an amateur. There's no one that's going to book those fights. I mean, and those amateurs might be very good, but there's a different level. So he could be 0-0 as an amateur and go pro if that experience is there. But, I mean, if it's not, it's not the recommendation I would make. I mean, if a fighter's coming in day one and they're like, I want to go pro, the best advice I'm going to give is kind of pump the brakes a little bit. But if there's a guy, I mean, and you might see that guy, I could say pump the brakes, and that dude could be the fucking prodigy. Like, legitimately, he comes in, he beats Damian's ass the first day, and it's just like, wait, what? Like, how'd you do that the first day? And that guy might be ready to make that jump, but that's so few and far in between.
And, well, one of the things that you said, like, I agree. No one just coming into the gym should just go pro right away. I don't agree with that. But there's one element that I think you touched on, but you ignore part of. And it's the guys that have been in the gym. You were saying if they've been competing in jiu-jitsu and racking up all these jiu-jitsu tournaments, there's just nobody locally for you to compete against, really, What about the guys that don't really compete in the jiu-jitsu tournaments and are always just whooping ass and sparring, just always in the gym, completely under the radar? You have no idea who they are. But Troy Jr.'s main training partner. They're John Castanada's main training partner. They're Sean McPadden's main training partner. And then one day they convince him, hey, should do this. And they don't want to waste any time. And I'm not saying, and like you said, that's far and few between, but there are those guys that just hang out in the gym, all of a sudden become legit badasses, and it's like, hey, man, you should fight. But ultimately, I've seen those guys take at least 2 or 3 amateur fights still before going pro. So,
for sure. And like those guys you're talking about are the scariest individuals, because if you're in a room with the baddest guys every day, you seeing what they're doing in competition, and you're able to, what you're doing with them in the gym, and you go, I'm good. I really don't want to compete. That guy, that is a methodical bastard. He's the scariest guy that you need to be around, because he doesn't. He's just like, nah, it's whatever. I'm learning this just for me. You know what I mean? And when you see those guys turn to compete, and whatever the reason may be, it could be age. I mean, another example top in my head popping right now. 2019 submission of the year on the amateur side winner, Jackson McVeigh. That's a name I heard for a while. People were saying, hey, this guy is going to be good. And when he turned 18, kind of waited for it, and then it didn't happen right away. And we talked to him ultimately about that. He wanted to wait till everything felt right. And you see the jump he made. And there's guys like that. I mean, you can be the best jiu-jitsu guy, but ultimately, with all due respect, I'm not talking about Jackson anymore, but, you might need to work on your striking. So amateur fights you might need 1 or 2 of those. But if you're going to use those to not, try to better your situation, then at that point, I mean, I'm not really sure what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, dude, I don't know. I feel like we answered the question and touched on another part. Unless you have anything more to say, I guess I'm kind of out.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I just want to emphasize again what I mentioned earlier. There are no silly questions. If you have any questions, reach out to Damian, message me, message the Trash Talk page directly. I love when we get a new one and we have a chance to sit down and talk about it. If you enjoyed this video, which I know you have, like it below. Subscribe to Trash Talk with Damian and TJ. And Damian, before we go, can you just remind them of the golden rule?
Oh, yeah. Message TJ, tell him fuck you, and also don't be a hoe.
That's part of the rule.